Hello, and welcome to part two, the theory of the two-video set on social disorganization theory. In the last video, we talked about the social context of Chicago. In that video, we talked about immigration from Eastern and Western Europe, as well as the Great Migration from the southern states, especially the southeastern states, into the northern states, especially Chicago and New York, but also Detroit, some into Boston, some into Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, but Chicago and New York were the primary cities where immigrants in both the immigration from Europe and the Great Migration tended to land. So we need to understand, though, the importance of the University of Chicago as we continue our journey into social disorganization theory. Now, the University of Chicago was important as an academic center in the first 30 to 40 years, even 50 years in the US, probably even more so than many of the Ivy League schools. The University of Chicago in the 1920s had this wonderful powerhouse football team. The faculty believed that football was distracting from academics, and they went to the Board of Trustees, complained about this, and said, we need to get rid of football. So what do you think the Board of Trustees did? They got rid of football. And it was a couple of decades later, I believe, that the University of Chicago came back with football, but they made sure that athletics did not detract from academics. At that point, the University of Chicago wanted to be known as an academic school, and they made a very strong academic reputation for themselves. Now, in this slide, we see in the center a photograph of Brad Pitt playing Paul McLean, Craig Sheffer playing Norman McLean. In the movie, A River Runs Through It. Now, that movie was based on the biopic short story by Norman McLean of the same name. It's a true story, although, Hollywood always dramatizes things in ways that aren't true to the story, because we just wouldn't watch it. That's on us, not Hollywood, by the way. So in the photograph to the left, you see the actual Norman McLean, and he's the older of the two boys, Paul, and their parents, taken in the teens, maybe early 1920s, but more likely in the 19-teens. Now, there is a photograph of a book cover on the right-hand side of this slide that may seem like it does not belong there, but it does belong there. Wimsett and Beardsley are the authors of this book. Beardsley helped write some of the chapters inside the book. That's why we attribute his name as well. But this book was written by two faculty at the University of Chicago who were colleagues of Norman McLean. In the movie, you'll see that he's about to move to the University of Chicago, where he is going to be a professor of literature. And he was one of the Chicago New Critics. So there are two concepts that are important that they developed. One is the intentional fallacy, which claims if you're reading a novel, don't try to read it to try to figure out the intended message of the author, because the author might not have been able to get the message across the right way. But the affective fallacy is how the book impacts us, or reader response criticism. And they also say, just because you think it means something, that doesn't mean that you're right. So they wanted the text to be able to speak for itself. So that's part of the Chicago New Critics. Now, this was all happening in the 20s and 30s. Very important to understand that this was happening at the University of Chicago, because at the same time, we have social disorganization theory being developed by Parkin Burgess and Sean McKay. So let's look at Parkin Burgess to start off. So Parkin Burgess based their theory on pond ecology. Now, I don't know about the subsequent generations, but in my generation, and I'm talking back in the early 1970s, so we're talking about 50 years ago, when I was in grade school, and I can't remember if it was third or fourth grade, I was required to learn pond ecology. Now, the basics, not college level stuff, not high school level stuff, but the basics. So we learned how ponds developed and then how they died. We learned all about the frogs and the lily pads and, all the things that go into that pond being a healthy ecosystem. So Parkin Burgess were taking earth science, ecology, and they transmitted that over into a study of the city. And in fact, the name of their book is The City. So you can see the book here. All right, so this is, it's published by the University of Chicago Press, and this is the book. This is the book. So you can still get it. It is in print, but it was published in 1925. Now, according to Robert Park and Burgess along with him, came along by the time that they were publishing this book, city growth follows the basic principles of ecology, and we can see them as organisms. Now, today we might say as systems, because we talk more about systems theory, but organisms are one form of system. And systems tend to grow regardless of whether they are organic systems or not. So they believe that city dwellers have a symbiotic relationship with the city, but they also believe that cities grow in a radial fashion from the center moving out. In other words, urban sprawl. So Ernest Burgess added the idea that the growth of the inner city puts pressure on the edges of the city, right? So that's very important to understand. Now, before we move on to Sean McKay, I want to read something to you. This is not in the readings for the class, so I want to read something to you. And this is from Parkin Burgess's The City. This is on page 24. In a great city where the population is unstable, not meaning that they're mentally unstable, but that means that it's constantly changing and it doesn't stay the same, where parents and children are employed out of the house and often in distant parts of the city, where thousands of people live side by side for years without so much as a bowing acquaintance, these intimate relationships of the primary group are weakened, and the moral order which rested upon them is gradually dissolved. And then if we move over to page 25, they write this: it is probably the breaking down of local attachments and the weakening of the restraints and inhibitions of the primary group under the influence of the urban environment, which is largely responsible for the increase of vice and crime in great cities. So the idea of attachments. Now, that's important because the idea of attachments is going to be a part of social control theory that we're going to study in this class as well. I think we're starting to see that social disorganization theory overlaps with Durkheim's theory of the mechanical versus organic society, but it will also overlap with social control theories or social bonding theories that we talk about later. So now let's get over here to Sean McKay. So they proposed a framework that began with the assumption that certain neighborhoods in all cities have more crime than other parts of the city. Now, we know that to be true. That we have figured out that that is right on. We know that. I mean, that's clearly observable. In today's world, we call those hotspots. And it results in hotspot policing, which is not necessarily a good thing. We're not going to talk about that in this video, but hotspot policing targets poor neighborhoods simply because poor neighborhoods is where the crime tends to occur, but it doesn't target reforming the poverty there. And reforming the poverty there would help curb the crime rate more than simply responding to crime when it occurs. But high crime neighborhoods have at least three common problems: physical dilapidation, poverty, and heterogeneity. Heterogeneity, okay, this is a term from Durkheim as well, that heterogeneity means the cultures are very different. They're not culturally stable because you might have 20 cultures living within these neighborhoods. Now, here we are over 100 years later, or, well, 98 years later. But here we are 98 years later, and those poor neighborhoods, the populations have become a lot more stable now than they were during Parkin Burgess and Sean McKay's time. See, during those times, with every influx of immigration, the folks that had been living there, they kind of worked themselves out of poverty some and got into the lower middle classes, or at least into the working poor, where they made a working wage and didn't have to live in the poorest of neighborhood, what we call the zone in transition that we'll get to in a minute. But instead, the makeup of that zone in transition kept changing. Well, the makeup of that neighborhood doesn't change much anymore, here 98 years later. But in those days it did. So there's less heterogeneity within those neighborhoods now than there were then. And here's why: because at that time, the population in those neighborhoods was highly transient. And unemployment among the residents of the neighborhood was high. So the factors of poverty, heterogeneity, and physical dilapidation lead to a state of social disorganization, which in turn leads to crime and disorganization. So the most significant contribution of Sean McKay, the social disorganization theory, is that it did demonstrate the prevalence and frequency of various social ills that tend to overlap with higher delinquency rates. So if you have these social ills and high delinquency rates, there's a huge overlap between them. Now, does one cause the other? You know, there's some research that suggests yes, some research that suggests no. But we at least know that the two overlap so much that we can still say if we can correct these social ills, or if we can at least significantly reduce these social ills, we can also significantly reduce delinquency rates. All right, so Sean McKay developed this idea of the concentric zones. So zone one is the loop. That's the city part, the city proper, the skyscrapers and all of that. And then just outside of that is the zone in transition. Some folks call it the zone of transition. Then there's the second immigrant settlement, and these are the folks that are kind of moving up a little bit. And then we've got the apartment houses and the bright light area. And then we move out into the residential areas with the single family dwellings. And then we get all the way out to the commuter zone. So I don't want to go into enormous detail about all of these different areas of the city. The only thing we need to understand is that the zone in transition is where most of the crime happens and where most of the criminals reside. in the zone in transition. This happens to be the most poverty-stricken area of the city. Now, there have been all sorts of racist myths that have developed over the years based on the racial makeup of the zone in transition. One of the things that we know is that it doesn't matter the racial makeup of the folks that live in the zone in transition. It's always the highest crime area with the highest residency of criminals. It always is. But we also know that the vast majority of those residents are not criminals. There was a time when that zone in transition was made up more of Jewish immigrants. Believe it or not, when that was the case, there was a myth that Jewish immigrants were the best basketball players. Very racist comment, very much like the racist comments we make now about those individuals of African origin who live in the zone in transition. Those are racist myths. Racist myths. However, folks that come out of the zone in transition do tend to be, we know this, do tend to be very skilled at certain sports. The ones that are easier to acquire equipment to play, such as basketball. Okay? All right, so it's just important to understand that the zone in transition, saying that that's where most of the crime is, we have to divorce that from the race of the individuals in that area. No matter what race lives in that area, that's where most crime occurs. It's unrelated to the race, it's related to the poverty. We need to always understand that. It is unrelated to the race. It is related to the poverty. Okay. So here we are with social disorganization theory. So low socioeconomic status, residential instability, meaning moving a lot, and the makeup of the population there. Those folks are constantly moving in and out, hence zone in transition. And then ethnic heterogeneity. Now let's talk a little bit about that ethnic heterogeneity a little more. What Parkin Burgess and Sean McKay meant by this was that you might have someone from an Eastern European country that speaks one language, and right next door are people from a Western European country that speaks a different language. So even if they have the same religion, they may have different languages and they cannot communicate with each other. And back in their homeland, they had a very close-knit community where it did take a village to raise a child, meaning if the parents didn't see a child doing something they ought not, other folks in the community would correct that child themselves. Everybody knew what was going on. They knew each other. And so they looked out for each other. In this zone in transition in the urban areas, the folks don't know each other like they did. And so we have this ethnic heterogeneity, a lot of different ethnicities, languages, and their cultural norms are different. So they may not correct a child that's doing something wrong because in their culture it may not be wrong. So all of these three things together lead to social disorganization. So that social disorganization means that there's a lack of social control, but there's also a lack of cultural transmission. Cultural transmission is where we pass on the folkways and the mores of our culture. There may be standards, that is written codes, but the folkways and the mores, so our cultural practice, the things that in our culture are just not done or have to be done, those things are not getting passed on. And so there's not a sense of connection to community, and that leads to delinquency. That's the heart of social disorganization theory. Now, I want to bring up Structural family therapy. Why? Because social disorganization theory suggests that this lack of rules and alliances within the community, families allying together to make sure that their children stay out of trouble together and all of those things, those are missing. Well, if we fast forward into the 60s and the upheaval of the 60s, now we're looking at this on a smaller cultural level within the family, not a group of a bunch of families together as a community, but now just within a single family. And a man by the name of Salvador Minuchin, and that is a photograph of him on this slide, developed what's called structural family therapy in his book, Families of the Slums. He's looking at the same type of adolescents and children that the social disorganization theorists looked at. And so he noted the role of family structure in treating families. So delinquency was related to poor family structure. So the rules, problems within the rules, problems within the delineated roles within the family, the alliances. Mom and young daughter might be allied against dad, and so dad might not have the same social cred within the family that others in the family do. So all sorts of things, but subsystems, the idea of subsystems within the family. So I just throw this slide up so that you understand that even into the 60s, the idea of structure in lack of passing on, as in the lack of cultural transmission and lack of informal social control, as in social disorganization theory, is being translated into family therapy where there is a delinquent teen within the family. All right, so let's look one more time at Durkheim. So as you can see from this, as societies move more into industrialization, they move from being a mechanical society or having mechanical solidarity to moving into organic solidarity. So mechanical is more rural, agricultural based, simple divisions of labor. There's homogeneity, meaning our group, we know each other, we're part of the same. Even if there is racial differences, it's an homogeneous group because they are together. They have the same rules. They have the same folkways, mores, and they work together with the same level of rules in order to keep their life stable, which gives them a much stronger collective conscience. So even though these individuals are much more independent, they have a stronger sense of community. And then we get into, with more industrialization, into more of the organic solidarity, the urban context, which is where Park and Burgess and Sean McKay come in. So an industrial-based economy. There's a very complex division of labor, and there's a lot of cultural and ethnic heterogeneity. So a lot of different cultures, a lot of different ethnicities, and they may not even speak the same language at the time of Sean McKay and Park and Burgess's work. That might have been true. So they didn't even have the ability to communicate with each other. And this resulted in a weaker collective conscience. So even though they're living in closer quarters to each other, they have a less collective conscience than the rural societies. So it's important to understand these things. So I want to stop the share. I want you to see The City by Park and Burgess. But Sean McKay had their share of books as well. And one, which I really like, is called The Jack Roller, A Delinquent Boy's Own Story by Clifford Shaw. Now, one of the reasons I like this is because, quite frankly, my grandfather was one of the delinquents of the 1930s. Um, um, he's told me stories of what he did as a teenager back in the late 20s and then early 30s. He was born somewhere in the 20s. I don't remember the exact year, but he's told me stories about his delinquent behavior and how he did something that almost sent him behind bars for a long time. But what was going on at that time was we had prohibition. So the child savers had finally, and all of those progressive groups that believed that alcohol was the bane of our society finally got the Bullshit Act. So throughout the decade of the 1920s, production, possession, and consumption of alcohol in the U.S., everywhere in the U.S., was illegal. We have that happening. We have the rise of organized crime within Chicago, within Chicago, that city, as well as New York and Boston. But so we have all of this happening. And it leads Parkin Burgess and Sean McKay to look at these more purely sociological interpretations about why crime is occurring in these particular areas. Very important to understand that historical context. So poverty is related to crime. Now, the next video is going to be about anomie and strain theory that overlaps these theories. And we're going to see that poverty, the idea of poverty, plays a big part in that explanation as well. Well, I will see you next video.